Las Vegas, July 1969. Inside a private dressing room at the International Hotel, the largest hotel in the world, Elvis Presley closed the door behind him before anyone else could walk in. Outside, 2,000 people were filling a showroom built especially for this night. Outside, technicians were checking lights that had never been used for a live performance like this. Outside, a band was tuning instruments for a show that had not happened in almost a decade. But inside that small room, none of that mattered yet. Elvis Presley had performed in front of millions, records, sold-out arenas, a career that had reshaped American music. But that night, he was afraid of one thing, and only Tom Jones, standing a few feet away, knew it. Tom had come to wish him luck. He had not expected what happened next. For a long moment, Elvis said nothing. He looked at the door, then at the floor, then at Tom, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than Tom had ever heard it. It was not the voice from the records. It was not the voice from the movies. It was the voice of a man who had not stood in front of a live audience in almost 9 years, and who was about to do it again in front of the entire world. To understand what Elvis was afraid of that night, you have to understand where he had been. By 1969, Elvis Presley had spent most of the decade making films in Hollywood, dozens of them. Soundtrack albums that sold steadily, but said little about who he really was as a performer. The man who had once shaken the world with raw, unfiltered energy had spent years standing in front of cameras instead of crowds, saying lines someone else had written, singing songs chosen for him by people who had never seen him perform live. Somewhere in those years, something had gone quiet. That summer, Elvis had decided to change everything. He assembled a new band. He rehearsed obsessively. He chose songs that meant something to him. Soul, gospel, rock and roll. The music that had shaped him before Hollywood ever did. And he agreed to open the new International Hotel with a live show. His first true concert performance in almost a decade, in front of an audience that included some of the most powerful people in entertainment. It was, by every measure, a gamble. If it failed, the headlines would not be kind. If it succeeded, it could mean a second life for a career many people quietly believed had already peaked. Tom Jones, meanwhile, was living a very different kind of moment. In 1969, Tom was at the height of his own rise. It's Not Unusual and Delilah had made him one of the most recognizable voices in the world. His American television show, This Is Tom Jones, had brought him into living rooms across the country every week. And in Las Vegas, he was quickly becoming one of the most reliable draws on the Strip. A young Welsh singer who filled showrooms night after night with an energy that audiences couldn't get enough of. Tom and Elvis had become close, not in the way the magazines described it, not as two competing stars circling each other for headlines, but quietly, as two men who understood something about each other that almost no one else could. Both had grown up without much money. Both had been told, at different points, that their voices were too much, too raw, too physical, too intense for polite audiences. And both had learned to turn that intensity into something audiences couldn't look away from. But there was a difference between them that night, and it was the difference that mattered. Tom had never stopped performing live. Night after night, in Vegas showrooms and television studios, he had kept that muscle moving, the muscle that knows how to read a room, how to feel 2,000 people lean forward at once, how to recover if something goes wrong in real time, in front of everyone, with no edit and no second take. Elvis had lost that. Not his talent. No one who heard him sing ever doubted that. What he had lost was the feeling of it. The feeling of standing in front of people who were not extras, who had not been told where to stand, who could simply decide, in real time, that they didn't feel what he wanted them to feel. And so, in that small room, with the noise of the crowd starting to build on the other side of the wall, Elvis Presley asked Tom Jones a question. He asked him whether the audience could tell. Not whether they could tell he was nervous. Something deeper than that. Elvis wanted to know whether an audience, a real, live audience, the kind that had not seen him in years, could somehow sense the gap between the man they remembered from the records and films and the man who was about to walk out in front of them for the first time in nearly a decade. He wanted to know if people could feel it when a performer was afraid that he no longer belonged on a stage. For a moment, Tom didn't answer right away. He had heard a version of this fear before, in his own life, long before fame, in small Welsh clubs, where he had stood in front of audiences who had no reason to care who he was. He knew what it felt like to wonder whether the room could sense doubt before a single note was sung. What Tom said next was not a performance. It was not the kind of thing either man would ever repeat publicly. And for years, almost no one outside that room would know it had been said at all. Tom told him the truth, that audiences can tell when a performer doesn't believe in himself, but they can also tell just as clearly when a performer does, and that the audience on the other side of that wall had not come to see the version of Elvis from the movies. They had come because somewhere they remembered the version of him that had once made a room feel like it was on fire. And if that version walked out tonight, even for a moment, they would feel it before he sang a single word. Elvis didn't say much in response. He nodded, the way people do when they've heard something they needed to hear, but weren't ready to talk about. Then he straightened his jacket, looked at the door, and walked toward it. The corridor outside the dressing room was narrow and crowded with cables, road cases, and stagehands pressed against the walls to let him pass. Nobody spoke. A stage manager mouthed a countdown with his fingers, and somewhere beyond the curtain, an announcer's voice rose over the room, building toward a name the crowd had been waiting years to hear again. Then the curtain moved, and the noise hit like a wave. 2,000 people rising at once, the sound of it pressing against the walls of the corridor where Tom still stood. For a moment, nothing came back through the wall but that sound. No music yet, just the roar of an audience reacting to a man they could finally see again in the flesh. What happened next has been written about many times. The opening notes, the roar of the crowd before he even began to sing. The band found its footing within the first few bars, and Elvis moved the way he had moved a decade earlier, as if no time had passed at all. Except that everyone in that room, including Elvis himself, knew that it had. He sang with a kind of hunger that surprised even the musicians behind him. Songs that had been carefully rehearsed in empty rooms suddenly had an audience to answer to, and Elvis answered back. He moved across the stage, reached toward the front rows, let the band stretch a note longer than planned because the crowd wanted it longer. Photographers in the front section lowered their cameras for entire stretches, simply watching. Between songs, he talked to the crowd the way he hadn't been able to in years. Not lines from a script, not a voiceover recorded months earlier, but real words said once to people who were really there. He laughed at something that went slightly wrong with the band and let the room laugh with him. He thanked them more than once in a way that sounded less like a performer, and more like a man who had not expected to be standing there at all. For a man who had spent years inside the controlled world of film sets, the unpredictability of a live room seemed, for the first time in a long while, like something to welcome rather than fear. The performance, by the end of that first set, would be talked about as one of the great comebacks in the history of American music, proof that the voice, the presence, the thing that had made Elvis Presley extraordinary in the first place, had never actually left. It had only been waiting for a stage worthy of it again. No film camera, no retake, no editor cutting the moment into something safer. Only the room, the band, and a man finding out in real time that he still belonged there. But for Tom Jones, standing at the edge of that corridor and listening through the wall, the moment that stayed with him was not the performance itself. It was the few seconds before it. The seconds when one of the most famous men in the world had quietly admitted to one person that he was afraid the magic might be gone. Tom stood there for a long while after the music started, listening to the crowd answer Elvis back, song after song, and thinking about the door that had just closed behind him. He did not go find a seat. He did not go back to his own dressing room to prepare for his own show later that week. He simply stood in that corridor, half hidden by a road case, listening to a friend find out the answer to the question he had asked only minutes earlier. In the years that followed, both men's careers would take very different turns. Elvis would return to Las Vegas again and again, becoming, in the eyes of many, the defining image of the city itself. Tom would continue to fill showrooms of his own, his voice carrying him through decades, through changing musical tastes, through a career that would later find an entirely new audience with songs no one expected from him. But Tom rarely spoke about that night in detail, not because it was a secret in the dramatic sense, but because it felt, to him, like something private. A moment that belonged to two performers, not to the public. A reminder that the men audiences loved as larger-than-life figures were, underneath all of it, just as capable of doubt as anyone else. What Elvis asked that night wasn't really about an audience at all. It was about whether the part of himself he had set aside for years, the part that had made him who he was in the first place, still existed. And in the only way he knew how, in the seconds before he had to find out for himself, he asked the one person he trusted to tell him the truth. Tom Jones gave him that truth, and then he listened, through a wall, as Elvis Presley proved it was real. That night in 1969 is remembered today as the night Elvis Presley came back. The records broke. The reviews were extraordinary. The image of Elvis in a black karate-style outfit, sweat-soaked and electric, became one of the defining pictures of his entire career. But before any of that, before the lights, before the roar, before the legend, there was a closed door, a quiet question, and a friend who told the truth. It is easy, looking back now, to think of these men only as the icons they became, the jumpsuits, the hits, the Vegas marquees with their names in lights. It is easy to forget that behind all of it were two people who, for a few minutes on a July night in 1969, were simply afraid, together, of the same thing. That the part of themselves the world loved most might somehow not be there anymore when it mattered. It was there, for both of them, for years afterward. It was there. And somewhere in that brief exchange, a question, a pause, an honest answer, is a small, quiet truth, about what it actually felt like to be one of the most famous men in the world, standing behind a curtain, waiting to find out if the magic was still real.